Joining me on the program is Martin Armstrong. Armstrong became a very successful business forecaster with Armstrong Economics, or Princeton Economics, which had offices in Paris, London, Tokyo, Hong Kong, and Sydney, employing more than 240 people around the world. In 1983, the Wall Street Journal cited Armstrong as its highest-paid advisor. He became one of the top currency analysts, and his work was requested by the Presidential Task Force, the Brady Commission, investigating the 1987 crash. Martin, I want to begin our discussion on economics, and one of the problems with a lot of economic consulting firms today is they are so far off the mark. A good example is this year, economists were predicting 3% economic growth. When that didn't happen in the first half of the year, they were talking about a second half recovery, which is looking rather weak. What distinguished your work at Princeton Economics, and what gave you the ability to make the accurate forecast that you did when you were at Princeton and are still doing today?
Well, I think largely the difference was that our clientele was international. And that really kind of forced me to look at everything through everybody else's eyes. And what you begin to see is that, unfortunately, in the United States, the predominant economic community tends to look at just the United States as if we're the only thing that really matters. And I think largely that's where they always end up failing. For example, the 87 crash, the reason we were really the only firm that was able to forecast that was simply because it's a fairly common sense thing. I mean, if you have sold all these assets, I mean, the Japanese bought, even Rockefeller Center, all the bonds in the United States, et cetera, they were buying. And then you stand up, you form G5, which is now G20, but in 1985, and then you say, well, to ease the trade problems and create employment in the United States, we're going to force the dollar down by 40%. So they don't understand, because they only look at it from an American perspective. But if you bought a lot of assets in Mexico, and Mexico stands up and says, by the way, we're going to devalue the Mexican peso by 50% next week, don't you think you'd sell and get out of there? That's the problem in America, is that we don't understand or respect so much the impact that we have globally. And the 87 crash took place because of foreigners were selling everything. And if you looked at the economic statistics, nothing happened. Interest rates didn't rise. There were no bad economic numbers, absolutely nothing. And that's what made it such a shock to everybody domestically. And that's when we got called in, and the Brady Commission at the end said, well, we think, they didn't want to admit that the G5 caused it. At the end, they said, well, we think it has something to do with currency. And when you're getting into these currency swings of 30, 40% in a 2 or 3 year period, you're dramatically changing the way capital moves globally. And probably any of your listeners that have invested in emerging markets or in Europe, whatever you've made on a particular stock in Europe, you've lost by the decline in the euro. So it doesn't much matter if I say, gee, look, I can make you $1 billion real quick in Zimbabwe, and they're going through hyperinflation, and it doesn't mean anything. So you have to really look at things from a global perspective, and that's been largely the problem in the United States, that it's too domestic in all its forecasting and everything else.
Your model predicted once again the top in the financial markets in February 2007, and then you also predicted the bottom. So once again, was it looking at the global macro picture that gave you that confidence? Because our guys over here completely missed it.
Yeah, you can't look at things just purely domestic at all anymore. We have a global economy. And if you look at the contagion that has taken place, that began off of mortgages in the United States. I mean, it wiped out Iceland. It has created a world recession to the point that on October 15th, you have the demonstrations around the world on this, Occupy Wall Street stuff. So we really have to understand it, that everybody's connected globally. And there's nothing that we can do that doesn't affect somebody else. And this is part of what you hear in criticisms coming from Russia and China about the U.S. dollar being reserve currency. Because if we increase our money supply to affect domestic rates, that is exported then, and they're suffering from inflationary pressures that are coming to their lands as well. So everything is very much connected, and the politicians don't appreciate, I think, really how globally the economy has evolved. I testified before Congress in 1997, and they were asking, well, gee, how come no American companies got any of the contracts in China to build the Yellow River Dam? And I said, look, the United States and Japan are the only two countries in the world that tax worldwide income. I said, so a German company bidding on the same project to build over there is already 35% cheaper. Then the German citizen who decides they would like to go over there and work for a year, do so tax-free from Germany. Only U.S. and Japan tax worldwide income. I mean, if you find a dime in a parking lot in London, they want their share. But, that's the problem. We're not competitive. And in the United States, you can see it, like there's 3 states that don't charge income tax. And like Delaware doesn't charge sales tax. So a lot of people move from Pennsylvania to Delaware just to have their mail order business. I mean, people do move around because of these issues. And you have a lot of companies that have left cities because of taxation. We really have to pay attention and be competitive on everything that we do.
This recently caused the head of Coca-Cola to say that the United States has become one of the most inhospitable places to do business. So this gets back to your point in your testimony, because if we have more regulations, if we have more taxation, if we're taxing the money wherever it goes, it makes us less competitive, and now we're not just competing against Europeans, we're competing against the Chinese, we're competing against the Brazilians. So it is really a global world, and you would think, Martin, that members of Congress would begin to recognize that.
Well, unfortunately, they're not economists. Most of them aren't even business people. Most of them tend to be probably the dominant profession are lawyers. And they have this attitude that, well, they can pass a law and everybody has to comply. But that's not the case. You can pass a law and say 55 miles an hour and nobody can go above that. Doesn't mean people aren't going to do so. But I agree. I mean, we're always looking at more and more regulation. And the problem is that we have this economic decline, and then the natural response from some of them say, oh, well, it wasn't regulated enough. We had more than 10 agencies regulating the CDSs that collapsed. Not a single one did anything to prevent a single crisis in this country. We keep adding layers and layers and layers of regulation that simply do not work. I mean, the SEC hasn't prevented one economic recession, one economic decline. We have too many agencies, and that is the problem. They created Homeland Security because they admitted that a lot of these agencies had information on 9/11. Even the people who were from the first attack on the World Trade Center had drew the World Trade Center on the walls of their jail cells with planes going into it a year before. They took pictures, all kinds of stuff, but nobody does anything. You have too many agencies, and so they created Homeland Security supposedly to sit on top of all these agencies to get the information. And we're just so over-regulated. I mean, just have one agency to do this. Why do we need so many different ones, and they all contradict each other, and then they compete and won't share information? So we seem to defeat everything that we do, but the answer is always not improve what we have, always add another agency. And to the point we have so many people running around, it's crazy.
Yeah, we just added in the financial regulations bill a consumer protection agency. What are they going to do that's any different than the other agencies that are out there regulating the financial markets?
Absolutely nothing. And if you really look carefully, the issues that created the problem, which was the derivative CDSs, they still didn't regulate. So they regulate everything else around it, but they just don't do whatever is right at that point in time. And they made it worse because these instruments are now, they changed the accounting system. We adopted Japan. So we're not even marked to market anymore. Now it's basically they don't have to even report a loss until they take it. So you're seeing the result of that in Europe, where all of a sudden some banks are going down, and people are then saying, oh my God, look at the portfolio that they had on these CDSs, but they don't legally even have to report it now. So it got worse, not better.
Let's talk about maybe one of the reasons why QE2 failed. I mean, the Fed announced last year QE2, it was supposed to stimulate the economy, bring down the unemployment rate, but what it did is it exported that money overseas. It forced a lot of those governments, especially in Asia that are pegged to the dollar, to print more money. Now they're dealing with higher inflation rates. And Martin, we're stuck today with a market that's exactly where it was when the Fed announced QE2. In your view, will they announce another QE3 or QE4 as some on Wall Street anticipate if the economy weakens?
Well, unfortunately, they feel they have to do something. But in all honesty, I think they do realize, at least the people at the Fed, that no matter what they do, they can't stop it. Because we are in a global economy. I mean, you take the QE2 idea that, okay, fine, you're going to buy 30-year bonds and you're going to take them in